Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video will be on secular morality, and the reason for my making of this video is because of the conversation or debate between Sam Harris and Jordan B. Peterson, and the contention that exists between the argument of values and facts. Can facts weigh on the value-based landscape of human interest? Primarily, will scientific and materialistic matters be things that can create ethical landscapes that are justified for us to follow and act through in our existence as human beings? Because human beings are things that are creatures that are not completely rational and do not abide by just the specifications of laws and systems. And so, also, by what basis does what objective basis does the human being have to ground their reflexivity in moral inclination when there is a subjective or relativistic landscape in terms of there is a multiplicity of actions that one could undertake and act out in their existence, and given that any one of these things would prove to be more right than the other on a basis of several contexts, can there be anything that we can grab onto and hold on to be an anchor for our moral reflexive systems? And is there any way to achieve this without looking to the metaphysical substrate, as Jordan B. Peterson likes to call it, or the religious revelatory aspect of cognition and our evolutionary makeup? So that's the background for all in which I'm going to explicate and structure my arguments around. There is absolutely things I find issues with in both Sam Harris and Jordan B. Peterson's arguments. But if you're asking me which side I take, I side with Sam Harris rather than Jordan B. Peterson, though I completely understand what Jordan B. Peterson is proposing. And many of the fears, if I want to make the most steelman case I can for the argument that Jordan B. Peterson makes, N.T. Wright and several other either Jungian Gnostics, mystics, or theologians make for the necessity of the metaphysical substrate, or the need for the anthropomorphic narrative to underpin ethics or morality, is that for the most part, human beings are creatures comprised of multiple factors in terms of their underlying architecture of instincts, motivations, and drives. And all of these underlying systems are mediated up a stratum of complexity that evolved over time. At least this is Jordan B. Peterson's argument, but it also fits with the theologian's argument, in which behavior in cultural context is something that gets layered upon the instinctual and motivational things. And it's also the case with the instinctual and motivational landscape that all the instincts and motivations are not harmonious, in the sense that they do not all push towards a socially equilibrated mean. And so it's not like if you were to let a human being run unfettered without influence and coercion by outside metrics, that they would find themselves fitting to what we would like to posit as an ideal mode of action or being. And why should such an ideal exist is also the question that one should raise, because with a human being you have a peculiar animal, and so far it's the only animal that is conscious of its actions, can reflect and project and extrapolate from them into the future, and look and weigh on it in terms of its own interest and the collective social interest that it's a part of. But it's the case that because of that, we're meaning-based things. You can't be an animal and not be a meaning-based thing, because you have pleasure and pain principles, and you are just, by your own biological and neurotypical makeup, the very neurology that comprises you and the physiology that comprises you, you will always live in a meaningful world. Whether or not you believe there's any inherent meaning in the universe objectively is independent of whether your biology disposes you towards seeing the world from what we would call meaning, or a meaning-based standpoint, which means that you confer existential items and properties out in reality because you have ends and goals you want to meet. So you care about how the world acts and how people interact with you, and how these things influence the overall ability for you to meet your ends, the longevity of the rational and irrational salient factors that you have going on in your belief structures, and so on and so forth. I mean, it gets rather complicated, but just to keep it in the most simplest sense, you can't be something that is without meaning. And so, because we're this way, and because it's an impossible thing for rationality to be the arbiter, if you will, the sole arbiter, if you will, of human actions, and the thing at which people can completely organize themselves and drive themselves behind, can one say that facts and rationality can stand as a basis for moral and ethical systems? And if I want to flesh out their argument even stronger, it's to say that it's most likely highly unlikely, because given the facts that we are these meaning-based creatures, meaning is not just because humans are abstracting. Meaning is not objective in the sense that meaning is not embedded in the objects themselves. It's rather a subjective sort of thing. It's what you confer from agreed upon stances in the social landscape that you're a part of, also through the context of history and cultural creation, because it's not the case that, stop signs are necessarily meaningful to a juvenile or to an infant, but since we have created infrastructure in America and we established these laws of the land and legalization of the objects that are out in the world and are abiding to them by way of tickets and punitive measures, it's the case that a stop sign is meaningful, and you have to consider it in terms of your existential or phenomenological output. Like, you might be peeved that you have to stop at the bottom of a hill to a stop sign because you're building up a set of momentum in your car and it's going to mess with the brakes or whatever, or it's making you late for work, or it's an inconvenience, So it's the case that can have negative meaning, or it can have positive meaning to you, as you see that, well, stop signs are in the world, so people can't do just completely retarded and crazy and convoluted actions with their car, because we have these safety mechanisms, or these instantiated items of legal meaning in the world. There's two different ways you could take it. Honestly, there's a lot more ways than that, because your phenomenological landscape is made up of your temperamental variances in the culture you're a part of, your sex, your IQ, your so many different factors, which are all independently distributed and almost seemingly random to a certain extent. So the landscape of meaning is one that's very vast and multifarious and multifaceted, and it's just the case that, well, if you're going to talk about something like that, something that is so outside of the scope of just a linearity in its makeup, then you can't obviously call it objective. And a good example, even more so outside of stop signs, is why people care about memorabilia or why religious artifacts or anything like that exists. Because if something has been used by, somebody's going to pay a lot of money for the glove that Michael Jackson wore if they have the opportunity to bid on it. Somebody will, just because Michael Jackson wore it. Or if you don't want the counterfeit of a Renaissance masterpiece, the actual thing, even though they might look exactly the same, and even though practically wise they're the exact same object in terms of the paint, the chemical makeup, and even the composition of the thing and the appearance of the thing, people will not prize the knockoff as much as they prize the original. And why that funny behavior is there is for anthropomorphic reasons and cultural reasons, ones that you could never get to as an individual of erasing in terms of your sudden brief appearance on this world for the most part. I mean, maybe you can chip away at it over time with various other people that come after you or whatever. I mean, that's what we've done with civil rights basically, but it's not the case that, you know, the world is handed to you without meaning in the first place, and it's not as if you're a thing that can live in the world even if you don't think there's objective meaning in the world. You can live in the world without being a meaning-based creature. This just won't happen. It's impossible. And so, given that this, and not the objective world, is mostly the stratum that we have to deal with in our modus operandi, or our mode of operations, or the way we choose to act in the world, then it would seem that the argument from the rational materialist that we should move ourselves away from the mythos and the unreal or non-true or irrational factors of knowledge is, if not disastrous, problematic, because there's no real solution on one end of the spectrum for what you can do to build up anything that addresses this landscape and fits all people. So if you're not, I mean, like, it's the case that at least some people would agree, or most people would agree, that temperamental variances, and most people would agree that study psychology or science would agree that temperamental variances and trait variances account for a lot of differences in outcome within individuals. And it's the case that not everybody's going to be an existentialist, and not everybody's going to want to be an existentialist, and there's multiple reasons for that. And not everybody can be an existentialist, because if you just don't know how to read, existentialism is not going to help you. You don't really need to know how to read to be a Christian. I mean, it helps because it makes you a good Christian to read the Bible, but there's a pulpit you can turn to every Sunday, like at least within a 5-mile radius of wherever you live, every Sunday, and there's a man there who's seemingly educated, more educated, and presumably higher in trait IQ than you are, who's going to take all of these factors and distill them for you and explain them in a very easy to understand narrative that usually has some kind of relation to your everyday existence in life, where that sort of thing, like if you really want to get at Nietzsche, I mean, Nietzsche's not for the masses, and he even writes like that. Or if you want to get at Camus, or you want to get at Sartre, or Heidegger, or Boswinger, or Maslow, I mean, most of them, and it's not just because of intellectual arrogance that these things are the way that they are, but just that reality is complex, and it's the case that if you would want to introduce, or the solving of these problems when you don't turn to the religious substrate makes them far more complex than they would be if you had turned to the thing. But it makes it all, and because of that infinite and complex, not of the infinite complexity, but because of that inherent complexity that's within the information, the knowledge, and the solutions to the existential tragedies of existence, or the salient, the phenomenological landscape, the landscape of meaning for a human being, it makes it untenable for a great many of people. People who don't want to sit around and read those things. People who don't have, if you're living in the middle of Wyoming, it's not to say that there aren't people in Wyoming that aren't into philosophy, but it's the case that it's more likely that you don't have anybody within your local radius that could distill the ideas for you. I mean, but that's what YouTube and things and other social media platforms help with. But your chances, your likelihood of looking for something like that, the likelihood of you finding something that's sufficient, the likelihood of if you're anyway on a distribution, if you're highly conscientious, likelihood slim. If you have an IQ less than like 100, not helping. It's just there's several factors that make it such that it's really problematic to come up with a secular solution. I mean, it's like there are some serious issues and problems, but the issue I take with this argument, because ultimately, I mean, like once you get past the practical the practical difficulties of trying to come up with a secular moral system, is the case that you have to deal with the I guess like epistemological and metaphysical issues. Why in the hell does a human being think that they have the capacity for moral reflexivity? And why should we trust that capacity for moral reflexivity if it just completely derives or comes up by way of biological and evolutionary factors? At least this isn't necessarily Jordan B. Peterson's argument. This is the theologian's argument. Jordan B. Peterson's argument is a bit more tricky to pin down and saying, well, what the problems are. But I'll start with the simpler one in terms of the theologian's issue with moral reflexivity, and then turn to Jordan B. Peterson. And I mean, I'm not going to criticize Sam Harris because right now that's like I don't have the time. I don't have the time to do that. And I really don't have I am a humanist. I'm an atheist, so you know, even if I do know the issues with his arguments, I mean, it's not, to me, they're not as consequential. I mean, they're really not. And I'll explain in terms of what the issues are with the theologian's argument, why it's not the case. A lot of times, now I am going to offend Christians, and if you're a Christian, I'm sorry. I am going to offend you. But just from a logical standpoint, you can't take in, so it's true that you can't quantify meaning. Like, you can't quantify meaning, you can't quantify emotion, you can't quantify many things that are a part of the irrational landscape of the human perception and cognition. And God knows they influence like so much of what you see in the world, because humans are just motivational creatures, behavioral motivational creatures at that. Like, it's like there's stratum to their structure that make them fairly complicated. You know, like if you want to put it on paper per se, and you want what you put on paper to be rationally or logically coherent and consistent. It's like coming up with the universal necessary condition for morality is damn near impossible. Really difficult. But that doesn't mean that you cannot. Well, but that doesn't mean that morality is embedded in the religious substructure either. I mean, that's usually what people say, that it's not embedded in the objective, scientific, empirical one. And so far, the best thing we've gotten, so far, the best solution and structures that mediate that landscape have been religious ones. So we assume that the only structures that can mediate, describe, and aptly direct the individual through these landscapes is a religious one. And I mean, like, that's not the case. Now, it's the case that there has been no secular, I guess, replacement that's been good. Like, there really hasn't. Ideologies are not the answer. But just because those aren't the answers does not mean that religion's the answer. I mean, that's what theologians say. That's basically what their argument is because these things aren't the answer, and this thing is the best approximation we have, then it can be the only thing. And it's not the only thing. The issue is people are just dumb, and it takes a very long time for us to gather the necessary facts, to understand things about the world, work them out, and codify them. I mean, it's like a process. Religion, even in its conception right now, didn't just suddenly become that way. It evolved over time and wound up being the thing that it is now. And it's the case that if you want to come up with any secular system, it's going to go through the same process, because that's just the way that knowledge works. Knowledge is a process. I mean, despite what anybody wants to say, it's a process. And it's a rather painful and difficult one, and it takes a lot of goddamn time, like, if I'm just being frank about it. But it's some really brilliant people. And I mean, it's multiphasic, you know, if that's the simplest way to say it. And because it's that way, you can look now and say that there is nothing there, and so this has to be the only thing. That's not going to be the case 50 years from now or 100 years from now. I mean, I promise you, it's going it's going to become more and more the case that we see that we do not have any need for religious systems